Your home, Mr. Thorne, is scheduled for auction this Friday at 10 a.m. sharp. According to Article 7, Section 4, Subsection B of the Harmony Creek Homeowners Association bylaws, all properties with outstanding liens in excess of 6 months of dues are subject to non-judicial foreclosure. As you can see, the sign is already posted. The voice was a viscous blend of manufactured sympathy and triumphant condescension, a sound I'd come to associate with Karen Miller, the president of our HOA and the self-appointed queen of our quiet suburban cul-de-sac. She stood on my perfectly manicured lawn, a large floral-printed woman whose physical presence was matched only by the immensity of her entitlement. Her pudgy finger, adorned with a gaudy ring, pointed towards a garish yellow sign hammered into the turf not 10 feet from my front door. Public auction, it screamed in bold black letters, with my address listed below like a tombstone marker. My home. The home my wife Sarah and I had poured our lives into, the place where our daughter took her first steps, was being advertised like a used car. The violation wasn't a structural issue or a public nuisance. It was the shade of beige on my mailbox, a shade I myself had corrected months ago using the exact paint code the HOA had provided. A $25 fine had somehow metastasized into a debt of over $5,000, a sum calculated to trigger this very clause. It was a weaponized bureaucracy, a death by 1,000 paper cuts, and Karen was wielding the final, fatal blade with undisguised glee. "There has to be a mistake," I said, my voice dangerously calm. It was a tone I'd perfected over 20 years in the Army JAG Corps, and another 10 on the federal bench. A quiet stillness that preceded a storm. She mistook it for weakness. "The only mistake, Mr. Thorne," she chirped, her smile widening, "was your assumption that the rules don't apply to you. We have records of all the notices, certified mail. It's all very legal, all very by the book." She patted a thick manila folder tucked under her arm as if it were the Holy Gospel. The book, I knew, was one she had written herself. If you've ever been on the receiving end of a petty tyrant on a power trip, if you've ever felt the suffocating grip of rules twisted into weapons, then hit that subscribe button right now. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and share your own HOA nightmare, because the story of how Karen Miller tried to auction off my house is a masterclass in what happens when a bully picks a fight with someone who not only knows the rules better than they do, but also holds the gavel in a court they didn't even know they were standing in. I watched her saunter back to her oversized SUV, the triumphant sway of her hips a final act of dominance. The sign on my lawn felt like a physical blow, a public declaration of failure. I walked over and touched the cold metal stake. This wasn't just about a house, it was about the principle of the thing. It was about the sanctity of a person's home and the perversion of community for the sake of one woman's ego. I pulled the sign from the ground, the earth sighing as it released its grip. I carried it to my garage and laid it on my workbench, a piece of evidence in a case that had just been opened. Inside, Sarah was standing by the window, her face pale. She had seen the whole exchange. "What are we going to do, Marcus?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I wrapped my arms around her, feeling the tremor of her fear. "We're going to fight," I said, my voice hardening from the calm I'd shown Karen into the cold steel of resolve. "She thinks this is her kingdom, and she thinks she's untouchable. She's about to find out that every kingdom has a judge, and she just tried to foreclose on his castle." What Karen didn't know, what she couldn't possibly comprehend in her small world of beige mailboxes and lawn height regulations, was that my name wasn't just Marcus Thorne, homeowner. It was the Honorable Marcus Thorne, United States bankruptcy judge. And in the most beautifully ironic twist of fate I had ever encountered in my career, the Harmony Creek Homeowners Association was petitioner number 23B714, a pending Chapter 11 case sitting right on my docket. Her little empire was bankrupt, and she was asking me, the man whose home she was trying to sell on Friday, to grant her the legal protection to keep it running. The war wasn't coming, Karen. It was already in my courtroom. After Sarah had gone to bed, her sleep aided by a cup of chamomile tea, and my reassurances that this would all be sorted out, I retreated to my study. This room was my sanctuary, lined with mahogany bookshelves filled with legal texts, military histories, and the leather-bound classics I'd collected over a lifetime. It was a space built on logic, precedent, and reason, the very antithesis of the chaotic, emotionally driven tyranny Karen Miller was peddling. I spread the thick packet of documents she had so smugly brandished across my large oak desk. The weight of the paper alone was an intimidation tactic, designed to overwhelm and confuse the average homeowner. But I wasn't the average homeowner. I was a man who had spent his career dissecting complex litigation, finding the fatal flaw in an opponent's argument, the single thread that, when pulled, would unravel their entire case. I started from the beginning. The original violation notice, dated 6 months prior. Mailbox paint non-compliant with Harmony Creek Architectural Standard 11C. A fine of $25 is assessed. I remembered that day clearly. I'd received the notice, rolled my eyes at the pettiness of it, and driven to the designated hardware store. I bought the can of Harmony Beige specified in the bylaws, spent a Saturday afternoon sanding and repainting the mailbox until it was indistinguishable from every other one on the block, and considered the matter closed. I had even sent a polite email with a photo attachment to the generic HOA admin address confirming the correction. There was no response. The next document was a second notice, dated 30 days later, assessing a $100 late fee and an additional $50 non-compliance fine. Then another and another. The fees compounded with dizzying speed. Administrative processing fees, legal review charges, intent to lien filing fee. Each letter claimed to have been sent via certified mail, a detail Karen had proudly emphasized. Attached to the back of the packet were copies of the certified mail receipts, each with a tracking number and a signature block. This, she believed, was her ironclad proof. But I saw the flaw immediately. The address listed on the receipts was 124 Willow Lane. I live at 142 Willow Lane. It was a simple, elegant piece of sabotage, a transposition of two numbers that sent every critical, time-sensitive legal notice to my neighbor 2 doors down, a kindly retired couple who spent 6 months of the year in Florida. They wouldn't have known to forward my mail. They weren't even there. The signature on the receipts was a faint, illegible scrawl, likely the mail carrier simply signing for an undeliverable letter at an empty house before returning it to sender. The HOA, and by extension Karen, would have received every single one of them back, marked "Return to Sender." They knew I never got them. They had to know. This wasn't a mistake. It was a strategy. It was mail fraud, plain and simple, a federal offense. I felt a cold anger settle in my gut. This was the kind of calculated malice that I'd seen in complex white-collar crime cases. The same arrogant belief that you could outsmart the system through procedural trickery. Karen wasn't just a petty tyrant, she was a predator. My history had prepared me for this moment. I grew up in a blue-collar family where respect was earned, not demanded, and where a person's word was their bond. I put myself through law school on the GI Bill after 2 tours with the Army's Judge Advocate General's Corps. I'd prosecuted soldiers for serious crimes in courts martial and defended the rights of those wrongly accused. I'd seen the absolute necessity of due process, of a system that, for all its flaws, was designed to protect the individual from the arbitrary exercise of power. When I retired from the military, I sought a quieter life, a place where the loudest sound was the laughter of my daughter in the backyard. We chose Harmony Creek for its promise of community, for its tree-lined streets and the illusion of peaceful order. I never imagined that the greatest threat to that peace wouldn't come from the outside world, but from within, from a homeowners association that had curdled into a caricature of authority. I'd watched Karen's rise to power over the last 3 years. She'd won the HOA presidency on a vague platform of restoring property values and enforcing the standards that make Harmony Creek special. She formed a board composed of her closest friends, a small cabal of gossips and sycophants who rubber-stamped her every decree. The monthly HOA newsletter, once a friendly bulletin of community events, transformed into a scolding list of violations and public shaming. The rules became more arcane, the fines more punitive. She was building her own little fiefdom, and the HOA dues were her taxes. Now, with this foreclosure action, she had escalated from petty tyranny to outright criminality. She had crossed a line, and in doing so, she had unknowingly stepped from her manicured suburban battlefield into my world, the world of federal law. I opened my laptop and logged into the public access to court electronic record system, the digital heart of the federal judiciary. I typed in the petitioner's name, Harmony Creek Homeowners Association. There it was. Case number 23, B714, Presiding Judge, Honorable Marcus Thorne. I stared at my own name on the screen. The petition had been filed 4 months ago. The reason cited was predictable: catastrophic revenue shortfall due to widespread resident delinquency. She was using the very fines she was illegally manufacturing as justification for seeking bankruptcy protection. It was a brilliant, perverse loop of logic. She was creating the disease and then petitioning the court for the medicine, a medicine that would grant her even more power to collect debts, to place liens, to ruin lives. A slow smile spread across my face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the grim, determined smile of a hunter who has just found the tracks of a very dangerous, very stupid animal. She thought she was the apex predator of Harmony Creek. She had no idea she was the one walking into a trap. The auction was on Friday. Today was Monday. I had 3 days to prepare my counterattack. It wouldn't be waged with angry phone calls or public scenes. It would be waged with motions, subpoenas, and the crushing, dispassionate weight of the law. The first step was to play her game, but to play it on my terms. An amateur would have hired a lawyer and fired off an angry letter. But I knew that a premature show of force would only give her time to cover her tracks. I needed to document her overreach, to give her more rope, to let her believe she was in complete control. My strategy was twofold. First, to establish a public record of my attempts to resolve the issue in good faith, and second, to gather intelligence from the community she terrorized. I spent the rest of Monday night drafting a letter. It was a work of art, if I do say so myself. It was polite but firm, meticulously detailed, and legally precise without being overtly threatening. In it, I formally disputed the validity of the debt, citing the lack of proper service as evidenced by the incorrect address on her own documentation. I requested a complete accounting of all fines and fees, a copy of the minutes from the board meeting where the foreclosure was approved, and proof of their legal authority under state law to conduct a non-judicial foreclosure, a practice that was highly restricted in our state. I also included a cashier's check for $25, the amount of the original, disputed fine, with paid in protest, written clearly in the memo line. This was a crucial step, demonstrating my willingness to settle the underlying issue while contesting the fraudulent superstructure of fees built upon it. I would not deliver this letter to her mailbox. It needed to be served in a way that created witnesses. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for Tuesday evening. Perfect. The Harmony Creek Community Clubhouse, where the meetings were held, was a monument to beige mediocrity. It smelled faintly of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. Karen sat at a long table at the front of the room, flanked by her board of directors, a grim-faced woman named Barb, who served as treasurer, and a nervous, balding man named Gary, the secretary. Karen presided over these meetings like a queen holding court. She wielded Robert's Rules of Order like a weapon, cutting off anyone who spoke too long or strayed from her rigid agenda. The first hour was a tedious recitation of committee reports, the Architectural Review Committee's latest crackdown on unapproved garden gnomes, the Landscape Committee's screed against clover in lawns. Several residents tried to raise concerns about the escalating fines, but Karen shut them down. "That is a private matter between the homeowner and the board," she'd say with an air of finality. "This is not the forum for personal grievances." Finally, she opened the floor for new business. This was my moment. I stood up and walked to the single microphone set up in the center of the room. "Marcus Thorne, 142 Willow Lane," I said, my voice calm and clear, projecting through the small room. Karen's eyes narrowed. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face. She clearly expected me to be at home, panicking. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice dripping with false patience, "as I just stated, this is not the place for personal grievances." "I'm not here to air a grievance, Madam President," I replied, meeting her gaze. "I am here to formally serve you in your capacity as president of the board." with a legal document. I held up the envelope. A murmur went through the 20 or so residents in attendance. This was not the usual programming. This is a cease and desist letter regarding the illegal foreclosure proceedings initiated against my property and a formal dispute of the alleged debt pursuant to the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. It also contains a good faith payment to resolve the original and only alleged violation. I walked forward and placed the envelope squarely on the table in front of her. Her face, a mask of composure moments before, was now turning a blotchy red. Barb and Gary shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "This is highly irregular," Karen sputtered, pushing the envelope away as if it were contaminated. "Our lawyers handle these matters." "I'm sure they do," I said, turning back to the microphone to address the entire room. "But since you saw fit to personally inform me of the auction on my own front lawn, I felt it was appropriate to personally deliver my response in this public forum. I want to ensure there is a clear public record of my attempt to resolve this matter reasonably before it escalates further." Her eyes flashed with fury. She had been publicly challenged, her authority questioned in front of her subjects. Her ego couldn't handle it. "Your attempt to resolve this is noted, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice tight with rage, "as is your clear failure to comply with community standards. This letter is nothing but legal mumbo-jumbo from a disgruntled resident trying to weasel out of his obligations. The board stands by its decision. The foreclosure will proceed as scheduled." It was exactly the arrogant, dismissive response I had hoped for. She had, in front of numerous witnesses, acknowledged receipt of my dispute and then summarily rejected it without review, steamrolling ahead with her plan. She was creating a beautiful paper trail of her own bad faith. As I walked back to my seat, I felt a new energy in the room. The fear that usually hung in the air during these meetings had been replaced by something else, a spark of defiance. After Karen angrily adjourned the meeting, several people approached me in the parking lot. An elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, whose prize-winning roses had been the subject of a month-long harassment campaign over their height. A young couple, the Patels, who were facing thousands in fines because their toddler's plastic slide was visible from the street. And a man named George, a retired CPA with sharp eyes and a quiet demeanor. "What you did in there," George said, shaking my hand, "took guts. She's been running this neighborhood like a prison warden for years." "She's breaking the law," I said simply, "and I think she's been getting away with it because she counts on people being too afraid or too isolated to fight back." "Well, she's not counting on that anymore," Mrs. Gable said, her voice surprisingly firm. "What do we do next?" This was the beginning of the second phase of my plan. I wasn't just fighting for my house anymore. I was leading a rebellion. We exchanged phone numbers and agreed to meet the next day. As I drove home, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't a complex bankruptcy case with faceless corporations. This was about homes, families, and the fundamental right to be left in peace. Karen Miller had started a war with one man, but now she was about to face an entire community. The following morning, my dining room table looked like a war room. It was covered in documents, my own meticulously organized file, and now the stacks of papers brought by the Patels, Mrs. Gable, George, and two other families who had heard about the meeting and asked to join our nascent coalition. As they told their stories, a sickeningly clear pattern emerged. Each case started with a trivial, often subjective, violation. A holiday wreath left up until January 2nd, a satellite dish that was allegedly visible from a certain angle, a basketball hoop stored on the side of a house instead of in a garage. In every single instance, the initial small fine was rapidly inflated with a cascade of administrative fees, legal charges, and late penalties. Notices were lost in the mail or sent with deliberate errors just like mine. The goal was never compliance. The goal was revenue. It was a predatory system designed to extract money from residents through fear and intimidation. She fined me $200 because my wind chimes were not in harmony with the natural soundscape, Mrs. Gable said, her hands trembling slightly as she pointed to a letter. "I've had those chimes for 30 years. My late husband gave them to me." The Patels had it even worse. Their file showed nearly $8,000 in accumulated fines and legal threats related to their children's toys. "She told my wife that our property was degrading the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood." Mr. Patel said, his jaw tight with anger. My kids are 5 and 7. They play in their own backyard. What are we supposed to do? The cruelty was breathtaking, but it was George, the retired accountant, who uncovered the engine driving the whole machine. While the rest of us had focused on the injustice of the fines, he had gone to the county records office and pulled the HOA's publicly available financial statements and tax filings for the past 3 years. He spread the documents across one end of the table. This is where it gets interesting, he said, tapping a line item under expenses. Look at this. Legal and collection services. 3 years ago, it was about $5,000 for the entire year. Last year, it was over $150,000. A 30-fold increase? I asked, leaning in closer. How is that possible for an HOA of only 200 homes? It's possible, George said, a grim look on his face, if your goal isn't to collect dues, but to generate legal fees. Now look at who the payments are going to. He pointed to the vendor name, Miller, Vance & Associates, PLLC. Miller, I repeated, the name hitting me like a physical blow. Any relation to Karen? Her brother-in-law runs the firm, George confirmed. I did a little digging online. The firm was founded 3.5 years ago, right after Karen was elected HOA president. They specialize in one thing, HOA collections. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't just a power trip. This was a racket, a conspiracy. Karen, as HOA president, would manufacture violations against her own residents. She would then pass these delinquencies to her brother-in-law's law firm. The law firm would then load up the accounts with exorbitant fees, which the HOA would pay, and then attempt to collect the inflated total from the homeowner through liens and foreclosure threats. The money wasn't just going into the HOA's coffers. It was being funneled directly to her family through a corrupt feedback loop. They weren't protecting property values. They were harvesting equity from their neighbors. The bankruptcy petition was the final brilliant move in their scheme. By declaring the HOA insolvent, they could argue in court for extraordinary relief, for the power to streamline collections, garnish wages, and expedite foreclosures, all under the protection of a federal judge. It would legitimize their entire criminal enterprise. She's using the residents' own money to pay her brother-in-law to sue them, Sarah whispered, her face ashen. It's evil. It was more than evil. It was a federal crime. Conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud. Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO violations. And, most deliciously, bankruptcy fraud. My mind was racing, connecting the evidence on my dining room table to the case file sitting on my desk at the courthouse. The petition Karen had signed, under penalty of perjury, claimed the HOA's financial distress was due to resident non-payment. But we now had proof that the distress was manufactured, a self-inflicted wound designed to justify a power grab and enrich her family. She had lied to a federal court. She had lied to my court. The initial plan to simply defend my own home seemed woefully inadequate now. This required a bigger, more decisive response. A response that would not only save our homes but dismantle Karen's entire corrupt operation and hold her accountable. The auction for my home was still scheduled for Friday. It was now Wednesday. I had to act fast, but I also had to be flawless. I turned to the group. Thank you, I said, my voice filled with a gravity that silenced the room. Thank you for trusting me with this. I know what we need to do, but it's going to require a leap of faith. I explained the situation, omitting one key detail, my profession. I simply told them that I had discovered a significant legal vulnerability in the HOA's position, a way to turn their own tactics against them. The foreclosure auction on my house is the tripwire, I explained. She has to believe she's winning right up until the last moment. We let her walk right into the trap. I had to recuse myself from the bankruptcy case, of course. It would be a gross violation of judicial ethics to preside over a case in which I was a creditor and a witness. But the rules allowed me to take certain actions before recusal, specifically actions to preserve the integrity of the proceedings. I excused myself and went back to my study. I drafted a single powerful motion, emergency motion for a Rule 2004 examination of the debtor. A Rule 2004 examination is one of the most feared tools in bankruptcy law. It's a broad, sweeping power that allows interested parties to put the debtor under oath and investigate any and all matters relating to their financial affairs. It's essentially a pretrial deposition with an incredibly wide scope. I named the person to be examined, Karen Miller, President. I scheduled the examination for Thursday at 2 p.m., the day before the auction. I listed the reason for the emergency hearing: to investigate potential fraud, dishonesty, and gross mismanagement in the debtor's financial affairs, which directly impact the debtor's qualification for Chapter 11 relief. I filed it electronically. Within an hour, the court clerk had processed it. The order was issued. Karen Miller was officially summoned. She wouldn't be coming to the community clubhouse this time. She was being called to my turf, the United States Federal Courthouse. She was about to find out that the legal mumbo-jumbo she dismissed was about to become the language of her undoing. Thursday afternoon, I walked through the granite halls of the federal courthouse, not as a judge, but as a citizen. I wore a simple charcoal suit, no robe. The familiar scent of floor wax and old paper filled the air. It was a place of immense power, a place where fortunes were decided and futures were altered by the stroke of a pen. It was a world away from Harmony Creek, and I had dragged Karen Miller directly into its center. Because of the direct conflict of interest, I had recused myself that morning, and the case had been immediately reassigned to my colleague, the Honorable Judge Eleanor Albright. Judge Albright was a sharp, no-nonsense jurist with a deep-seated contempt for bullies and frauds. I had met with her in chambers for precisely 10 minutes, laying out the basic facts: the HOA's bankruptcy petition, the foreclosure action against my home, the evidence of mail fraud, and the potential conspiracy. I didn't have to tell her what to do. Her eyes, magnified by her reading glasses, had glinted with what I could only describe as righteous indignation. My motion for the debtor examination would be the first order of business on her new docket. I entered courtroom 4B and took a seat not at the bench, but at the plaintiff's table. The room was designed to inspire awe and intimidation. The ceilings were high, the walls were paneled in dark wood, and the American flag stood sentinel beside the judge's empty chair. A few minutes before 2, Karen swept in, followed by a slick-looking lawyer in an expensive suit. This was undoubtedly her brother-in-law, Mr. Vance. Karen looked supremely confident. She was wearing a garish fuchsia power suit, her hair sprayed into a rigid helmet. She probably thought this was a mere formality, a bit of procedural nonsense before her final victory tomorrow when my house would be sold. She scanned the courtroom, her eyes briefly passing over me without a flicker of recognition. To her, I was just some anonymous man in a suit. I was part of the furniture. Her lawyer, Vance, approached the debtor's table, swaggering as he set down his leather briefcase. He leaned over and whispered something to Karen, and she laughed, a shrill sound that was jarringly out of place in the solemn room. They had no idea what was about to happen. At precisely 2 p.m., the bailiff's voice boomed. "All rise!" Judge Albright entered, her black robes swishing behind her. She took her seat at the bench and surveyed the room, her gaze lingering for a moment on Karen and her lawyer. "Please be seated," she said. "We are here to hear the emergency motion for a Rule 2004 examination in the matter of the Harmony Creek Homeowners Association, case number 23B714. Counsel, please state your appearances." Vance stood up. "Good afternoon, Your Honor. Daniel Vance for the petitioner, the Harmony Creek HOA." "And for the moving party?" Judge Albright asked, looking directly at me. I stood. "Good afternoon, Your Honor. Marcus Thorne, appearing pro se." A flicker of confusion crossed Vance's face. He glanced at me, then back at the judge. Karen, however, was still oblivious. "Mr. Thorne?" Judge Albright began, her voice neutral. "The court has reviewed your motion. It makes some very serious allegations. You are a resident of the Harmony Creek community, I presume?" "I am, Your Honor. My family and I reside at 142 Willow Lane." I saw Vance's head snap in my direction. He leaned over and whispered urgently to Karen. I watched as the color drained from her face. Her smug smile vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of disbelief. The man whose house she was auctioning tomorrow was here, in federal court, arguing a motion against her. The trap had been sprung. "Objection, Your Honor," Vance stammered, scrambling to his feet. This is a clear conflict of interest. Mr. Thorne is a disgruntled party in a collections dispute with the HOA. He is using this court to harass my client and interfere with a legitimate legal proceeding. Sit down, Mr. Vance, Judge Albright said, her voice dropping a full octave. Mr. Thorne is a creditor in this case, as his property is subject to a lien by the debtor. As such, he has standing. Furthermore, his motion alleges fraud, which is of paramount interest to this court. I am granting the motion. The examination will proceed now. Ms. Miller, please approach the witness stand. Karen looked like she might faint. She shot a panicked look at her lawyer, who could only offer a helpless shrug. She rose unsteadily and made her way to the witness stand. The bailiff administered the oath. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God? I do, she squeaked. Judge Albright looked at me. Mr. Thorne, you may begin. I rose and walked to the lectern, placing my notes on its slanted surface. I looked directly at Karen. The Queen was off her throne, stripped of her board and her bylaws, sitting under the unflinching gaze of federal authority. Good afternoon, Ms. Miller, I began, my voice even and calm. For the record, could you please state your full name and your position with the Harmony Creek Homeowners Association? Karen Ann Miller, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I'm the president. Thank you. Ms. Miller, in your capacity as president, are you familiar with a property located at 142 Willow Lane? Yes. And is it true that the HOA, under your direction, has initiated foreclosure proceedings against this property? Yes, she said, a little more defiantly now, for non-payment of fines. And is it also true that a public auction for this property is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 10 a.m.? Yes. Excellent. Now, Ms. Miller, let's talk about the fines. The original violation was for non-compliant mailbox paint, correct? Among other things, she sniffed. Let's stick to the mailbox for now. A fine of $25 was assessed, is that right? I believe so. I walked to my table and picked up a document. I'm handing you what's been marked as Exhibit A. It is a copy of the certified mail receipts your own foreclosure packet claims are proof of service. Could you please read the address on those receipts for the court? She took the paper, her hands shaking. She stared at it for a long moment. Read the address, Miss Miller, Judge Albright commanded. It says 124 Willow Lane, she mumbled. And I live at 142 Willow Lane, don't I, Ms. Miller? A simple transposition of numbers. A mistake that sent every single legal notice to an empty house, ensuring I would never have the opportunity to contest or pay the escalating fines. Was that just an unfortunate clerical error, Ms. Miller? She didn't answer. She just stared at me, her eyes wide with panic. Let me rephrase, I continued, my voice like ice. Did you, at any point, receive these notices back, marked Return to Sender? Her lawyer shot to his feet. Objection! Assumes facts, not in evidence. Overruled, Judge Albright snapped. Answer the question, Ms. Miller. You are under oath. Karen swallowed hard. We may have. You may have? Ms. Miller, mail fraud is a federal offense. Lying under oath in a federal court is another. I strongly suggest you choose your next words with extreme care. Did you or did you not knowingly proceed with collections and foreclosure, aware that proper legal notice had not been served? The room was silent. Karen looked at her lawyer, at the judge, at me. The walls of her petty kingdom were crashing down around her, and she was trapped in the rubble. The silence in the courtroom stretched for an uncomfortably long time. Karen Miller sat in the witness box, her face a pallid mask of sweat and cheap foundation. Her fuchsia power suit now looked less like a symbol of authority and more like the garish costume of a clown whose act had gone horribly wrong. Her lawyer Vance was on his feet, sputtering objections that Judge Albright swatted down with irritated waves of her hand. The trap wasn't just sprung, its jaws were closing. Ms. Miller, I repeated, my voice leaving no room for evasion. I will ask you one more time. Did you knowingly pursue this foreclosure action while in possession of evidence that proper service had not been achieved? She broke. Her carefully constructed facade of righteous indignation crumbled into a pathetic whimper. Our lawyers handled the mailings, she deflected, her voice cracking. I just signed the papers they put in front of me. I assumed everything was done correctly. It was a weak, cowardly attempt to shift blame, and it reeked of falsehood. I decided to pivot, to open a new line of attack that would expose not just her incompetence, but her criminal intent. Very well, I said, my tone suggesting I was accepting her flimsy excuse, which only seemed to make her more nervous. Let's talk about those lawyers. The firm representing the HOA is Miller, Vance and Associates, correct? Yes. And the principal partner of that firm is Mr. Daniel Vance, the gentleman sitting right over there? Yes. What is your relationship to Mr. Vance, Miss Miller? Objection, Vance shouted, his voice shrill with panic. Relevance. My client's personal relationships have no bearing on this case. Overruled, Judge Albright thundered, glaring down at him from the bench. This is a Rule 2004 examination, Mr. Vance. The scope is broad. I find the question of the debtor's relationship with its primary legal counsel to be highly relevant, especially given the extraordinary legal fees listed in your bankruptcy petition. Answer the question, Ms. Miller. Karen shot a desperate look at her brother-in-law. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, but it was too late. The lie was already visible in her eyes. He's my sister's husband, she stammered. He's my brother-in-law. A low murmur rippled through the small public gallery, where George, the Patels, and Mrs. Gable were sitting, watching the proceedings with rapt attention. I see, I said, letting the implication hang in the air. So, you, as HOA president, hire your brother-in-law's firm to handle collections? And in the last year, the fees paid to that firm have increased by nearly 3,000%, correct? I don't know the exact numbers, she mumbled, refusing to make eye contact. Oh, I do, I said, pulling another document from my file. This is your own financial disclosure statement, filed with this court under penalty of perjury. It shows $152,000 in payments to Miller, Vance, and Associates last year. Ms. Miller, can you explain to the court how an HOA for a 200-home community could possibly rack up that level of legal fees in a single year? People don't pay their dues, she said, falling back on her rehearsed script. We have to be aggressive to protect the community's finances. Or is it, Ms. Miller, I pressed, my voice rising with controlled anger, that you and your brother-in-law created a scheme to defraud your neighbors? A scheme where you invent trivial violations, deliberately fail to provide proper notice, allow fines to balloon with manufactured fees, and then pay your own family member exorbitant sums of money to place liens on your neighbors' homes? Isn't that what's really happening here? That's a lie, she shrieked, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. It's a disgusting lie. I am a volunteer. I work tirelessly to protect our property values. I let her outburst fade into an embarrassing silence. Then I delivered the final blow. I walked slowly back to my table, picked up my briefcase, and placed it on the lectern. I opened it and pulled out a thick, bound volume. It was a copy of the United States Bankruptcy Code. The sight of it seemed to suck all the remaining air from her lungs. Ms. Miller, I began, my voice now low and grave, are you aware that filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection requires the petitioner to act in good faith? Yes, of course, she whispered. And are you aware that this good faith requirement extends to all of the debtor's actions, both inside and outside of this courtroom? I suppose so. Then perhaps you can explain this to the court, Ms. Miller. How do you reconcile your duty of good faith with your attempt to conduct a fraudulent foreclosure on the private residence of a federal officer? Specifically, I paused, letting the weight of the moment build, the United States bankruptcy judge who was, until this morning, assigned to preside over your case? It took a second for the words to register. When they did, the effect was devastating. Karen's face went completely blank with shock. Her jaw hung open. She looked from me to the empty judge's robe on the coat rack behind the bench, and then to Judge Albright, whose expression was pure granite. The blood drained from her face, leaving it a pasty, unhealthy gray. Her brother-in-law Vance looked as if he had been struck by lightning. He sank into his chair, his head in his hands. He understood the implications immediately. They hadn't just picked a fight with a stubborn homeowner. They had tried to defraud, harass, and seize the property of the very judge they were asking for help. It was an act of such stupendous arrogance and stupidity that it defied comprehension. It was contempt of court, witness tampering, and obstruction of justice all rolled into one. Judge Albright leaned forward, her voice low and laced with cold fury. "Ms. Miller," she said, "the examination is over. The U.S. Trustee's Office will be launching a full, immediate investigation into the financial affairs of the Harmony Creek Homeowners Association. All assets of the HOA are hereby frozen. A temporary restraining order is issued, effective immediately, barring any and all collection activities, including the foreclosure sale of Mr. Thorne's property, which I find to be retaliatory and conducted in catastrophic bad faith. Mr. Vance, I suggest you advise your client not to leave town. Bailiff, please escort Mrs. Miller from the witness stand." Karen remained frozen, catatonic. The bailiff had to gently touch her arm to get her to move. As she was led away, a broken and defeated woman, she looked at me one last time. There was no anger in her eyes, no defiance. Only the dawning, terrifying realization of just how completely and utterly she had destroyed herself. The fallout from the debtor examination was swift and brutal. Judge Albright's order sent shockwaves through the small ecosystem of Karen's corrupt enterprise. The U.S. Trustee, a division of the Department of Justice responsible for overseeing bankruptcy cases, descended on the Harmony Creek HOA with the subtlety of a SWAT team. They were auditors and investigators with subpoena power, and they used it with surgical precision. Bank records were seized. Computers were confiscated from the sad little office in the community clubhouse. Every email Karen had ever sent from the official HOA account was now evidence in a federal investigation. George, the retired accountant from our little band of rebels, became an invaluable asset to the trustees' team. He spent days with them, walking them through the crooked financials he had uncovered, pointing out the shell games Karen and her brother-in-law had played with the HOA's money. The picture that emerged was even uglier than we had imagined. It wasn't just the fraudulent legal fee loop. Karen had been using the HOA debit card for personal expenses. Lavish dinners, spa treatments, online shopping sprees, all coded as community engagement or office supplies. She had approved no-bid contracts for landscaping and pool maintenance to companies owned by her friends, who then kicked back a portion of the inflated fees to her in cash. The HOA wasn't just bankrupt, it had been systematically looted from the inside out. The news ripped through Harmony Creek like a hurricane. I came home from the courthouse that evening to find my front lawn dotted with neighbors. They had seen the moving trucks from the trustee's office at the clubhouse. They had heard the rumors. When I pulled into my driveway, they erupted in applause. It was a surreal moment. Mrs. Gable hugged me, tears in her eyes. Mr. Patel shook my hand with a grip of pure gratitude. For years, these people had lived under a cloud of anxiety, constantly looking over their shoulders, worried that the length of their grass or the color of their welcome mat would bring financial ruin upon them. Now the sun was breaking through. We held an impromptu town hall right there in my driveway. I explained what had happened in court, sticking to the facts but not downplaying the severity of the findings. The mood in the crowd shifted from relief to a hard, cold anger. They had been cheated, bullied, and stolen from by one of their own. They wanted justice. Within 48 hours, a petition to recall the entire HOA board had garnered signatures from over 80% of the homeowners. An emergency meeting was called. This time, there was no pretense of order. Karen's sycophants on the board, Barb and Gary, were shouted down before they could even speak. They were voted out unanimously, a public humiliation that was only a prelude to the legal troubles that were coming their way. In their place, a new interim board was elected. George, the hero accountant, was named treasurer. Mrs. Gable, a symbol of resilience, was made secretary. And to my complete surprise, the community voted me, Marcus Thorne, as the new interim president. I tried to decline, citing my profession and the need for impartiality, but they wouldn't hear it. "You saved us, Marcus," Mr. Patel argued. "We trust you to get us out of this mess." I reluctantly agreed, on the condition that it was a temporary role, just to oversee the transition and the rewriting of the community's bylaws. The next Saturday, instead of watching an auctioneer sell my home, Sarah and I hosted a barbecue for the entire neighborhood. We set up tables and chairs in the backyard, fired up the grill, and watched as kids who had been forbidden from playing on the common green areas ran wild and free. The oppressive cloud of Karen's reign had lifted, and the simple joy of being neighbors was palpable. My daughter Maya brought out the original offending object, the little ceramic garden gnome she had painted in vibrant, clashing colors. It had been hidden away in the garage for months. She walked over to the now perfectly beige mailbox and placed the gnome right at its base, a small, cheerful sentinel guarding our home. It was no longer a symbol of violation. It was a trophy, a monument to a victory hard won. As I stood on my deck, a plate of food in one hand and a cold drink in the other, watching my neighbors laugh and talk, I felt a profound sense of peace. The fight had been ugly and stressful, a violation of the quiet life I had sought, but it had also forged something new. It had taken a collection of houses and turned them back into a community. We were no longer isolated individuals, afraid of a petty tyrant. We were a united front, and we had taken our neighborhood back. The legal battle was far from over, but the war for Harmony Creek had been won. The wheels of federal justice grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. The U.S. trustees' investigation was thorough and damning. Their final report, a document over 200 pages long, was a detailed account of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. It was promptly forwarded to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the district. 6 months after that fateful day in court, a grand jury handed down a series of indictments. Karen Miller, her brother-in-law Daniel Vance, and the 2 other board members, Barb and Gary, were arrested. The charges were extensive. Multiple counts of mail fraud and wire fraud for the fake notice scheme, conspiracy to commit fraud, and, for Karen and Vance, the particularly serious charge of bankruptcy fraud for lying on their petition to my court. The local news stations, which had previously only covered our HOA for its award-winning petunias, were now parked on our streets reporting on the suburban crime ring. The trial was a spectacle. The U.S. Attorney's Office asked me to be their star witness. I took the stand, not in my judge's robes, but as a citizen, a victim. I calmly and methodically walked the jury through the entire saga, from the first notice about my mailbox to the climactic debtor examination in Judge Albright's courtroom. I presented the doctored certified mail receipts, the threatening letters, and the timeline of the escalating fraudulent fees. Karen's defense attorney tried to portray me as an arrogant, powerful man with a vendetta, a federal judge who used his influence to crush a simple neighborhood dispute. It was a desperate strategy, and it backfired spectacularly. The prosecutor followed my testimony with a parade of other Harmony Creek residents. Mrs. Gable told the story of her husband's wind chimes, her voice trembling but resolute. The Patels described the stress and fear of being threatened with a lien over their children's toys. George, the accountant, took the jury on a guided tour of the HOA's cooked books, explaining in simple, clear terms how Karen had siphoned their money into her brother-in-law's pockets and her own. The prosecution presented bank records, damning emails, and testimony from the contractors who had been forced to give Karen kickbacks. The evidence was a mountain, an avalanche that buried the defense's flimsy arguments. The jury was out for less than 4 hours. The verdict was guilty on all counts for all 4 defendants. The sentencing hearing took place a month later. I attended, sitting in the back of the courtroom. Karen, stripped of her power suits and her arrogance, looked small and pathetic in a drab prison jumpsuit. She wept as her lawyer begged for leniency, painting her as a naive volunteer who got in over her head. The prosecutor stood and methodically dismantled that narrative. "This was not a mistake, Your Honor," she argued. "This was a calculated multi-year conspiracy to use a homeowners association as a personal piggy bank and an instrument of terror against her own neighbors. She preyed on the elderly, on young families, on anyone she thought was too weak or too intimidated to fight back. She perverted the idea of community and used it as a weapon for personal enrichment." The judge agreed. Barb and Gary, for their roles as willing accomplices, received sentences of 18 months in federal prison. Daniel Vance, the lawyer who had abused his position of trust, was sentenced to 3 years and was subsequently disbarred. And then came Karen. The judge looked down at her from the bench, his face a mask of stern disapproval. "Ms. Miller," he said, "you were entrusted with the leadership of your community. Instead of fostering harmony, you sowed discord. Instead of protecting your neighbors' homes, you tried to steal them. You showed a shocking lack of remorse and a profound disrespect for the law. It is the sentence of this court that you be committed to the custody of the Bureau of Prisons for a term of 5 years. A gasp went through the courtroom. 5 years. It was a heavy sentence, but it was a just one. As the U.S. Marshals led her away in handcuffs, her face was a crumpled mess of tears and disbelief. The Queen of Harmony Creek was going to prison. The criminal case was closed, but our fight wasn't quite over. On the heels of the conviction, our new HOA board, with the help of a reputable law firm working pro bono, filed a massive class action civil lawsuit against Karen, her brother-in-law, and their co-conspirators. The goal was simple: to claw back every penny of the fraudulent fines, illegal fees, and embezzled funds. Faced with the mountain of evidence from the criminal trial, the defendant's insurance company settled almost immediately. A check for nearly $500,000 was delivered to the Harmony Creek Homeowners Association, money that would be used to refund the victims and repair the damage done to our community. The nightmare was finally, truly over. The months following the trial were a time of healing and rebuilding for Harmony Creek. The settlement money was distributed back to the residents who had been victimized by Karen's scheme. Mrs. Gable received a check that brought tears to her eyes, not for the money itself, but for the validation it represented. The Patels used their refund to build a beautiful new swing set for their children, a permanent fixture in their backyard that no one would ever dare call a violation. As the interim president, my first and most important task was to lead the community in rewriting our governing documents. We assembled a committee of residents, lawyers, accountants, engineers, stay-at-home parents, and spent weeks poring over the old bylaws. We tore them apart, page by page. We slashed the labyrinth of ambiguous, subjective rules that Karen had used as her weapons. No more regulations on the specific shade of beige for a mailbox or the approved decibel level for wind chimes. We replaced them with clear, simple, common-sense guidelines designed to maintain the safety and structural integrity of our homes, not to police personal taste. We instituted ironclad financial controls. All expenditures over $500 now required board approval and 2 signatures. The HOA's books were to be professionally audited every year, with the results posted publicly for all residents to see. We created a transparent and fair process for handling disputes, with an independent arbitration committee to hear appeals. We transformed the HOA from a punitive, top-down authority into a genuine community-led organization, a tool for service rather than a weapon of control. My tenure as president was short, as I had insisted it would be. Once the new bylaws were ratified by a near-unanimous vote, I stepped down, and the community elected a new, permanent board. George naturally stayed on as treasurer, his watchful eye a permanent guard against any future financial shenanigans. The final act of our collective victory was deciding what to do with the remaining settlement funds. After all the victims had been made whole, there was still a significant amount of money left over. The new board held a community-wide meeting to solicit ideas. Some suggested a new security gate. Others wanted to resurface the tennis courts. But it was Mrs. Gable who made the suggestion that resonated with everyone. For years, she said, her voice clear and strong, our common areas were places of anxiety. We were afraid to let our children play there, afraid to plant flowers, afraid our presence would attract the wrong kind of attention. I think we should use this money to build something that represents the opposite of all that. A place of joy, of freedom, a new playground. The idea was met with a roar of approval. A playground committee was formed, and the whole neighborhood got involved. Designs were submitted, equipment was chosen, and on a series of sunny weekends, residents came out with shovels and hammers to help with the construction. It was a true community effort, a physical manifestation of our newfound unity. The playground was completed in the spring. It was a beautiful modern structure with slides, swings, and a small splash pad for the hot summer months. On the day of the dedication ceremony, the entire neighborhood turned out. The new board president made a short speech, thanking everyone who had stood up to the old regime. Then, to my utter astonishment, he unveiled a small bronze plaque at the entrance to the playground. It read, Thorne Park, dedicated to the principle that a community is strongest when it stands together for justice. I was speechless, humbled by the gesture. Sarah squeezed my hand, her eyes shining with pride. My daughter Maya ran off to be the first one down the new slide, her laughter echoing across the green. I stood on my front porch a few days later, looking out at the neighborhood. My mailbox was still the perfect shade of harmony beige, but sitting proudly at its base were now two garden gnomes, the original, multicolored one, and a new one Maya had painted to look like a superhero. Thorne Park was bustling with the happy sounds of children playing. My neighbors waved as they walked their dogs or pushed strollers. The oppressive silence of Karen's reign had been replaced by the comfortable, easy noise of a community at peace. I thought about the nature of power. Karen had wielded it like a cudgel, believing it made her strong. But her strength was an illusion, built on fear and paper-thin rules. True strength, I had been reminded, came from something else entirely. It came from the quiet courage of a neighbor who refuses to be bullied, from the collective power of people united by a common cause, from the unshakable belief in due process and the simple, elegant force of the law. I didn't ask for this fight. It came to my doorstep, hammered into my lawn on a garish yellow sign. But by standing my ground, by choosing to fight not just for myself but for my neighbors, I had inadvertently saved more than just my home. I had helped save the soul of our community. And that was a victory far more valuable than any piece of property. The peace I had sought when I moved to Harmony Creek had been shattered, but what replaced it was something better. A hard-earned peace, a resilient peace, built on a foundation of shared struggle and mutual respect. My home was safe, my neighborhood was free, and justice had been served.